Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kate Griffin, Director of Programs here at the Aspen Institute Financial Security Program, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's important discussion. I want to start by thanking each of you for coming along as we dive into a topic that touches the lives of so many, how we manage and react to unexpected financial shocks. We titled today's conversation a little provocatively, "Is $400 enough to cover a financial emergency?" Thank you all for taking the bait. And while this question might seem straightforward, the measurement has stood for something in our ecosystem for some time as a stand-in for how we understand fundamental questions about financial stability and security. But we also know from dialogue with people in community that unexpected expenses or surprise changes to wages, these problems are not going away for many people in our country. We must continue to deepen our understanding of those financial emergencies to inform the kinds of market-based and policy responses that are needed. In the next hour, we'll be examining new data and innovative approaches to understanding financial emergencies. Our knowledge of what's happening for households has advanced since we first began measuring that statistic. And by delving into the kinds, frequencies, and impacts of those shocks, we can build a clearer picture of the challenges people face and use that to develop more inclusive financial systems and solutions that enhance financial well-being and financial security. We're fortunate today to be joined by an esteemed panel of experts, each bringing a unique perspective to that conversation. So how we'll handle the day. First, we'll kick off the conversation with a presentation from Scott Fulford at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. He brings new research on how these emergencies are affecting households and insights into areas where further exploration is needed, which will then set the stage for our panel discussion led by my colleague, Stephen Brown. After that, we'll engage in a conversation that will hopefully leave us with a deeper understanding of financial shocks and inspire ideas for advancing this important work. So it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Scott Fulford. And Scott, you can turn your camera on and join us. Scott is a senior economist at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, where he leads the Making Ends Meet survey. His academic and policy research examines the economic problems that individuals and households face and how they use financial products to help deal with them. He is also the author of The Pandemic Paradox: How the COVID Crisis Made Americans More Financially Secure. So thank you all once again for joining us, and I'm looking forward to an insightful and thought-provoking discussion. Over to you, Scott.
Thanks so much. And I'm going to share my screen. And let's see, hopefully that should show up. And please do interrupt me if my slides are not showing. I believe they should be, but it's always, when we're doing things remotely, it's always being careful. So first, just a brief disclaimer. The views I'm going to say in this presentation and in later discussion are mine and are not necessarily the views of the CFPB or the United States. So I think it's worthwhile stepping back and thinking very briefly about about the big picture of some things. If you read the financial press, or at least the financial press as it relates to consumers, stories like this one are really common. So I took this one from a story in the New York Times, which was about people who were increasingly living in their cars. And it describes a woman who developed a series of bad events led to her living in her car in her car parking lot. So first, her car broke down, and that was really expensive to fix. And then she had medical bills, and then her landlord raised her rent. And the combination of these things led her into some really dire circumstances. But here's the really interesting thing. Her income didn't change. It was actually a fairly good income for her era. So one of the things that I've been trying to understand is how common are the shocks that Crystal faced, and how often do they cause financial distress? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some results from a survey we've been running. At the CFPB, I lead a survey that we've been calling the Making Ends Meet survey. And in it, we try to understand the kinds of things and the kinds of problems that lead consumers to have problems making ends meet. And what we're going to try to understand is how often are the kinds of things that Crystal faced, things like a major out-of-pocket medical or dental expense, or a major vehicle repair, how frequently are those, and what are some of the costs? So the advantage of asking people in a survey is that we can ask things that help us understand things that you wouldn't necessarily get from bigger administrative data. For example, there are some really crucial words here: significant, unexpected expenses. So things that people weren't planning to do. So we might be interested, for example, if somebody decides to buy a new car. But we're really interested in terms of understanding, well, if they have a problem, well, maybe it was because their car was totaled and they had to buy a new car unexpectedly. I'm going to show you some results that come from work I've done with my colleague David Lowe and with co-authors at the CFPB, including Marie Rush, Eric Wilson, Courtney Shoup, and Emma Kalish. And just to say that no research is done in a vacuum. And of course, my goal here is not to discuss everything about this research, but to give you some of the high-level things that we're finding that might inform some discussion later on. And of course, as always, research is ongoing. The other panelists are going to have their own views on things that may challenge some of the things I say, and that's all right. That's how we learn about how work is going. But part of the value of explaining things is to learn about and develop and better understand the world. So let me give you a really big picture. Those significant unexpected expenses that I was talking about, things like crystals, are very common. 71% of American consumers are going to experience at least one significant unexpected expense. And if they experience them, some people are going to experience truly catastrophic ones that really put them on a path to financial disaster. However, I think it's worth just saying many people are going to experience relatively small expense shocks. So I have dropped my cell phone in the last year. It was unpleasant. I had to pay to get a new one because it was broken. That was not a catastrophic shock for me, but for some people, maybe that could be. And so part of one of the things we want to understand is what exactly it means to have this kind of shock. So one way to look at that is that the average household with an expense shock is going to spend about 16% of its income on unexpected expenses. And putting some numbers on that, the median, that's the 50th percentile, is going to spend around $5,000. But the truly catastrophic expenses pull things way up. So the mean expense is around, adding all of them up, is around $12,000. And I think that's a really important thing to remember, that we might be exposed to many things that could go wrong, but sometimes a lot of things are going to go wrong. So what are some of the things that people experience? Well, this list is taken exactly from in the order of the questions I showed you from the survey. And I'd like to talk about several different pieces of it. So first, just lots of different kinds of expenses are common. So this is the percent of people who experience them. But I think even more, many of them are also very large, either as a percentage of the person's income or in the median or mean out in the tail. So let me think about a couple of them. So 31% of people told us that they faced a major unexpected out-of-pocket medical or dental expense. And the average expense, the median was about $2,500. The mean was close to 6,000, was more than 6,000. Again, that's that long tail. But other expenses were also fairly large. About the same number, in fact, slightly larger, experienced a major vehicle repair or replacement at 9% of their income, or nearly $5,000, or $2,000 at the median and $5,000 at the 75th percentile. 25% experienced a major appliance or house repair. 30% dropped their phone like I did. But the nice thing about phones is that relative to your car, they are just less expensive. And so the median person only spent around $800, which is approximately the cost of replacing a new phone or maybe a laptop. And other expenses ended up being less common, but pretty large. So for example, legal expenses are not as common, but when people experience them, they end up being quite large. Before I go on, I want to talk about two different things that I think kind of help us understand what are the consequences of shocks. So far, what we've been asking people is, did you experience a big shock, a big financial shock that was unexpected and was significant to you? But that doesn't necessarily cause financial problems. And in fact, many people who experience these shocks are not going to have a problem. They're going to use their accumulated savings and pay off the shock and pay off the expense. However, many are not. And I think we want to sort of understand the difference between people who can pay off and people who can't. And that's in some senses the question of, is $400 enough? So to put some numbers on that, I'm going to pull from some results we published from our 2019 survey. In that survey, 40% of consumers reported that their household had difficulty paying a bill or expense. And this is intentionally a vague prompt. We want to understand the full sense in which people have problems. So some people, for example, may say that they had difficulty paying a bill or expense because they had to actually put something on a credit card. For others, it may be that they couldn't pay it at all and had to cut their food budget. And we ask a lot of questions to sort of understand those consequences. But I think one of the things that's really important about that is when people say they had difficulty paying a bill or expense, we ask them what caused it, what caused you to have difficulty, if there was one. And because we want to understand the things that lead into when people are having problems. And you'll notice this list includes many of the things that people were telling us before. People were allowed to check more than one, so this is not exclusive. 50% of people who had a difficulty paying bill or expense and said that there was a cause said it was medical expenses or fees. And those fees were unexpected for most of them. Loss of job or income was also important. Auto repair, helping family or friends. Home repair, again, an unexpected expense. And finally, I want to quickly show some results about thinking about what people do when they have difficulty paying bills. So again, first, many people who have an expense use their savings. So we were only asking these questions of people who had difficulty paying a bill or expense. And we've grouped some things together, and these options are not exclusive. So many people did more than one. Around 50% of people who said they had difficulty paying a bill or expense borrowed, either formally from a financial institution or informally from friends or family. But just as many cut back on other expenses, including regular household expenses like food and utilities. Many are going to look at some sort of way of juggling other bills, or maybe not paying this bill or negotiating. But one thing that's important about all of this is that families are going to use a whole portfolio of adjustments and are really going to face a lot of hard choices when they face these difficulties. And many of these expenses really are many of the unexpected expenses are very common. So they're going to face many of these difficulties. So I will stop here and turn it back over.
Thank you for that really engaging presentation, Scott. I'd like to welcome the remainder of the panelists to come on stage or to the screen. Great, and so, oh, we're missing one, but I'll give them a minute to join. So, all right, great, we have everyone. Thank you all for being here today. I'm really looking forward to this engaging discussion, both discuss Scott's paper, but also the work that each of you have been doing on this particular topic. So we're just going to go around and do a round of introductions so everyone knows who everyone is, and we're going to jump into Q&A. So first and foremost, my name is Stephen Brown. I am the Director of Insights and Evidence at the Aspen Institute Financial Security Program, where I lead our research work here. And so, of course, Aspen covers a range of different areas related to household finance, including understanding financial shock. So this is a really important issue, I think, to understanding our work and to the leaders that we engage. And so next, I want to turn to Jeff to introduce yourself.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Jeff Larimore. I'm the section chief of the Consumer and Community Research section of the Federal Reserve, which means I should give the same disclaimer that Scott did. Everything I say today represents my own views, not those of the board. But our section's role is to conduct research on the financial circumstances of low and moderate income households. And as part of that, in 2013, we started the survey of household economics and decision-making, which includes a number of questions about people's financial circumstances, one of which is the question asking people if you had a emergency expense that you had to pay that was $400, how would you pay that expense? So we've been using that and a number of other questions in the survey to track people's household finances and financial fragility over the past decade.
Great. Chris?
Thanks, Stephen. My name is Chris Wheat. I am the president of the JP Morgan Chase Institute. We are a think tank located within JP Morgan Chase, and we use de-identified customer and client data to look at a lot of questions, of which this general topic, maybe even getting a little outside the boundaries, are quite a common topic for us. We're very interested in how households are doing, how they're managing their finances, how they respond to shocks as one lens on that. And then we recently did some work more narrowly trying to understand from our data, joint with some other data, not just like what we see families do when they experience a shock, but kind of a little bit more projectively what we think that they could do. So excited to talk about that here.
Great, thank you. And Samer?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Samer Hassan. I'm the National Storytelling and Engagement Manager with Young Invincibles. We are a policy advocacy and research organization devoted to uplifting the voices of young adults in the political process. We focus on a couple key issue areas. So we focus on workforce development, civic engagement, healthcare, and higher education. Nice to meet you.
Great. So jumping straight into the discussion, my first question is for Jeff and Chris. So first off, Jeff, what was your reaction to Scott's presentation? What did you think about the data, and how does it align and with the work that you've been doing over at the Shed?
Yeah, so really appreciate the presentation, Scott, and I'm a huge fan of the Making Ends Meet survey, so it's always great to see it presented. I think that what Scott's showing is really a great complement to some of the things that we've been focusing on with the Shed. Scott's talked a lot today about the types of emergency expenses that people have, and that's something like our survey is really focused on how people would pay some of these hypothetical emergencies. And I think that really complements this question of how frequent are they, what types of expenses are they, and we all have some really good data about that. In particular, it really jumped out at me how common and how frequent these expenses are, and I think that that's has a lot of implications as we think about what the solutions are. One other thing that really jumped out to me is the fact that a lot of people would turn to friends and family and these informal borrowings as part of their toolkit for solving these emergencies. We see that as well, that's a relatively common aspect of people's financial resilience plans. And I think that's also one that gets just a lot less attention. So it was interesting to see you really call that one out, Scott, as part of your presentation, and as one of the things that you're seeing in that survey.
And Chris, I know that you your team recently released a brief on this exact issue on people's ability to handle financial shocks. And so could you talk a little bit more about your reaction to Scott's presentation, but also more about the work that you recently released?
Yeah, and much like Jeff, he's complimentary in two senses here, right? The work is good, and it also, I think, really adds a new perspective, or a really helpful perspective to the kind of work that we've been doing. It's like I suggested before, we recently took a look at what we could see in our consumer, a combination of like checking account data, a lens on sort of credit availability, to see what kinds of liquidity they might have, be it checking, savings account, ability to cut back on expenses, or kind of turning to different sources of credit. And it really did line up pretty well, especially kind of with two things. One, seeing the kinds of expenses that people experience and sort of like how they quantify is not something we certainly did in the last study. So like getting a sense of like what that range was really, really helpful in making sense of our results. So if I remember correctly, I started writing down notes like after the slide was gone. Most of those median levels were I want to say up north of $800. I want to say the smallest one was the one you referred to as like the cell phone expense. And we looked specifically at kind of what we thought people could cover at $400 and $1,600, and saw, especially at the $400 level, a lot of families being able to cover with those kinds of mechanisms, and then less so as you kind of go up the size of the expense. So we definitely didn't look in the $2,500 dollar range that was on the right side of Scott's distribution, and in some sense it felt complementary. So again, we think it's interesting to understand the piece that you can see from what administrative data suggests you could do, but what people do and how they think about it, and whether or not it's really unexpected. Like all those things are things that we can't really see in administrative data, that the kind of survey work that both Scott and Jeff have done, for that matter, are really helpful for.
Yeah, and that's I think a great transition to, I think, the framing for the bulk of the rest of the conversation. So I think there's two broad points we want to get into with the rest of our questions. Is one, this point you just raised exactly, Chris, is that there's some important space to dig into between how could people respond to unexpected expenses and how they actually do once those expenses hit. And the second reflection, or a second kind of direction we want to take the conversation in, is based on Scott's research. Unexpected expenses appear to be both pretty common and pretty expensive, potentially even more than we thought. And so on the first point around what people could and what they actually do, I think it's important to acknowledge, because the could is about the type of resources people have to their disclosure. What is the scale of resources? Like, so, it's what do people, what can people access in order to help them manage these events? But then when you go to the actually do, I think there's a question that's interesting to dig into around the scale of disruption. Like, what happens to families? How do they recover? Like, what is money getting spent on? What is money not getting spent on? And so I think that's an important thing to keep in mind as we're talking about the kinds of shocks and the frequency of shocks that people could experience. And so with that in mind, I know, Jeff and Chris, your data speaks a little bit more to the would and could side of this. And of course, Scott, your data is able to actually get a little bit into more like what the households actually do. And Sam, we're coming to you in a couple minutes. I want to know, you've worked a lot with young adults who experience disruption that these events cause. And so I think it'll be especially helpful to hear you say more and share about the trade-off, the disruption. How do families actually deal with this once these events come their way? So with Jeff and Chris, could you say more about the types of resources that households have in order to deal with financial shocks? And what does that say about their financial resilience?
I can start if you want, Chris. So we certainly know that most households have bank accounts. Like 95% of households have bank accounts, but there's a big disparity in that, or a big difference in that based on people's income. We see higher rates of not having bank accounts among low-income populations. We also see big racial divides in that. But at an aggregate level, about 95% of households do have a bank account that typically has some amount of money in it. Most also have credit cards that can be used to provide some level of liquidity when they have financial emergencies, and it varies based on whether people pay that off each month or not. And so, consistent with that, like with our question that we have in the shed, most people, like the most common ways that people are going to be paying these sorts of expenses is with the cash they have in their checking or savings account. With the credit card, they pay off in full at the end of the month. So when you hear our statistic about the share who would pay, that's kind of what we're thinking about as the cash and cash equivalent. And then for those that would be using borrowing, it's typically going to be a credit card. We do see people borrowing from friends and family. There's lots of discussion around payday loans and things like that as a way that people are turning to. We actually see that as being far less common. Pretty small share of people say that that's at least how they would expect to be paying. That might differ from what they actually then end up doing. So those are some of the things that people at least tell us in terms of the resources they have and how they would be covering expenses. We also, I think an important point here as well is that we've seen a big improvement in the share who say they use cash or cash equivalent over the past decade. But this is something that when we first asked this question, it was about half of people telling us they would pay using cash rates equivalent, and now it's up around 63%. But you also mentioned this idea like the would versus could piece. And I think that's a really important distinction. For the shed, we very squarely are asking people, how would you pay? And Neil Buda and Lisa Detling, who are economists at the Federal Reserve, used Survey of Consumer Finance's data to look at how many people just didn't have $400 in their bank account at the end of the month. And I'd love to, I think they start hearing how this lines with Chris's work with JP Morgan Chase Institute's important. But they found that once you account for what people probably have earmarked for their monthly expenses, it was closer to a quarter not having enough to cover $400 emergency. And so less than what we're seeing with our would question, but still a lot. We also see about a sixth of people in this shed saying that they had at least one bill that they didn't pay in the last month, getting to this idea of the frequency and sort of struggling with every kind of day-to-day expenses. So I think that there's a lot in this with kind of this, what is it that people have and how would they be using it for these emergencies? I think that there are some differences between what people say they have and kind of how they would like, or how people say they would handle this hypothetical emergency, and how they then are going to subsequently actually cover it. But what I don't want to do is lose the forest for the trees. I think no matter how you measure it, there's a decent amount of financial fragility that remains in society, and how much I think there's some uncertainty about, but it is there, and that's what we're really trying to deal with and try to think about how we can help people with.
Thanks, Jeff. The broad categories that we're looking at, I think, line up pretty well to the framework that Jeff outlined. Of course, we're constrained to the kind of things that you could see through bank account data, which is certainly not all things. So we don't have a lens on, we have a good lens anyway on whether people are borrowing money from friends and family or something like that. But certainly the checking account piece is a category that we're looking at. We see in a fairly detailed way something about what people are typically spending. So that gives us a lens, some ability to try to put some bounds on precise statement about what's a more discretionary expense versus what's more of a utility bill payment or something that we think of as not so easy to turn off. And we were really trying to hone toward the things that were things you might want to go to first, right? That are going to be doing less economic harm in the long run. So we looked at the cash, that lens that we can get from people, looking at people spending on what might be a little bit more discretionary, and then using credit cards specifically as a instrument to borrow against, like how much could you do before the billing cycle ended, essentially, and then how much might you do with a couple more months. But the 2 points of alignment are one that I think that's most of the things, but not all of them that Jeff mentioned in terms of what you could do. In this most recent, we did not look at what you would do, but there's enough there of these kind of increasingly more impactful things, like a big enough chunk of people who would turn to these other sources that at least aligns with some stories around the fragility that we see in households. And notably, again, it's more pronounced. We see more families that are able to use these kinds of mechanisms to pay for such an expense when the expense is smaller, of course, like a bigger expense. It's harder for all, but in particular for lower income families, right? We see a decreased ability to use any of these mechanisms, which again, I think aligns.
Great, thank you. Samara, turning to you now, could you say more about, with the young adults that you work with, what does it look like when people are confronted with the dropped cell phone or the unexpected tuition payment, or what does that look like in real life for the people that you work with?
Yeah, thank you. I have the pleasure of speaking to young adults across the country every single day, and every single day is a new story of a financial hardship, a hurdle overcome, and absolute resilience. we know that young adults 18 to 34 that make under 64,000, I believe, spend around 47 to 48% of their entire income on just basic needs. In New York alone, why I surveyed young adults 18 to 34, and we found that 48% have absolutely zero money saved for any financial hardship or financial shock. I spoke to a young man in New York that was starting college. He was taking this statistics class. It was about to begin, and then he got an email saying his one statistic book cost $400 for his class. He couldn't take it. He couldn't afford it. He ended up having to drop out of that course solely because of the cost of his textbook, and that pushed him back a long time. I believe he may still be in college right now, still trying to finish up his general ed requirements. And that was about 4 years ago. That one class set him back years just because he could not afford it. There was another young lady in Texas. She was receiving absolutely necessary medication. And overnight, the cost of her medication went up around, I want to say it was like $350 to $370, could not afford it. She was living in Texas, close to the Mexican border. She ended up having to drive to Mexico every week, just tried to get that same medication at a cheaper cost. So a lot of these financial hurdles are literally the difference between life and death for a lot of these young adults. I know $400 may not seem like this substantial amount of money for a lot of people in this audience, but young adults, especially 18 to 34, marginalized young adults, historically excluded young adults, that is very much the difference between moving up the economic hurdle, getting the cost of your medication needed to have a life, and just surviving in this country. Those are just two of the many stories that I've heard throughout this country.
So before transitioning to, thank you all for these comments. And before transitioning to the next part of our conversation around how common are these expenses, how much do we see them? Scott, I wanted to give you another minute or two to reflect on anything additional you wanted to share about what happens when people have these expenses from your data or from reflection from the conversation so far.
Sure. Well, so maybe just to say, I previewed the results just really briefly, but one of the things that we try to really track, so we want to both understand the shocks that people are exposed to, kind of all the bad things that can happen, but also really think through kind of, okay, how often do people have difficulty? And sometimes people might have problems that aren't caused by some big event. They might just have problems because their spending is just a little bit more than their income, or their income goes down a little bit, and then things don't match up, and eventually it all becomes a problem. So we've been asking sort of a different set of questions, those difficulty paying questions. And one of the things that we really are interested, I showed a little bit of the graph at the end, was, okay, people are going to use lots of different ways. They're going to borrow from friends and family, they're going to cut back on things. So I think that's really important. The other set of questions is we actually ask then, okay, you had this problem, what else did you do about it? And what people tell us, at least on a survey, and I should say surveys are about asking people, so we get to get some intent, but it's also we're meeting people where they are, and that's the way they're thinking about it. People tell us that things like they cut back on food, and they cut back on medical expenses and other things to kind of make all of the jigsaw puzzles add up so that they could make ends meet. And so I think it's worth remembering that kind of as Samar was mentioning, the costs of not being able to meet these things that come up often extend into lots of parts of your life. Maybe it's the medical expense that you were able to pay, but maybe you did that by cutting back on food, or maybe you did that by borrowing from your parents, or maybe you did that from, and as I often joke, the highest effective interest rate loan is that loan from your brother-in-law, because he's going to remind you about it every Thanksgiving for the rest of your, for the next 10 years. And so kind of those costs can be really large, even if they don't show up in the money cost of your borrowing.
So thinking about both the type and the frequency of these expenses, one of the things I think I what's the most surprising or interesting to me about your presentation and your research, Scott, but also I think related to the work that all of you have been doing, is the kinds of expenses that people are facing can be fairly small, but I guess we should say the kind of disruptive and unexpected expense people could be facing could be fairly small, or they could be quite large. $5, $6, $10,000. And so, how do you all think about like measuring for this concept, right? Is we have the $40 measure that the shed has done, which is giving us a lot of insight and information, but should we also be tracking $1,000 emergency expenses or $2,000? How do we calibrate getting at what did disruption look like, and are we kind of capturing these disruptions at the right scale?
I guess I would argue we need to be tracking a number of different thresholds. It's not that there's a single threshold where if you have this much money, you're going to be in good shape for every emergency that comes along, and if you have less than that, then you're not. When the Federal Reserve started tracking $400 as a threshold, we saw it as or at least I saw it as a kind of necessary but not necessarily sufficient threshold. There were other surveys that were asking about 3 months emergencies, $2,000 emergencies, etc. And I think it'd be great if everybody had 3 months of emergency savings built up, but for a lot of people, that's just not realistic. So I think that we really need to be measuring multiple different thresholds and being able to say, okay, what sort of emergencies are people really prepared for? Are they in good shape for small ones, but not the large ones? Are people struggling on both the small and large ones? They're telling us somewhat different things.
I mean, one reflection is I find it, well, two things. One, really useful to have kind of a longer time series where we measure the same thing, because when you're interested in sort of how macroeconomic cycles, other things that are changing sort of in the broader environment are like showing up in this dimension, that's really super helpful. So I don't mean to say that I don't mean to exactly say that the level doesn't matter, but like when you have a consistent level over time, that's really useful for any level. And so, Jeff, don't change it just quite yet. Maybe we're a little where I'm going with it.
We're not planning on it.
Great. All right. Thank you. But also, sort of pulling back to, I think, Samer, like what you were saying before, and certainly what we see, like what is a lot or a major expense really matters. I mean, it really varies a lot by the kind of household and family or person you're talking about. So as long as we don't, so in the world where it was free to run many surveys with many different levels longitudinally over time, et cetera, like other thing I think most of us know is quite difficult to do. It would be great to see lots of different levels, so you can see, for the person for whom the $50 expense is a lot, like that's a relevant question. For the family that can easily cover $2,000, you're sort of missing something. I don't have a solution other than just reflecting back that again, maybe this is Jeff, what you said, like seeing multiple thresholds and trying as best as we can to map those to the lived experiences of other families we're trying to understand, I think would be helpful, but it's not free, so we have to make cutoffs and trade-offs somewhere. But we don't, but then we can't get at, we use administrative data, which is great because it allows us to sort of observe certain things, but we don't have like the information about what does it mean to the family, was it unexpected, all the things you would only really be able to get out of a survey.
I think a lot about young adults. I'm not a data expert, but all I think about is young adults, and I appreciate that you brought that up, Chris. No matter who you ask, the ones that I speak to, 18 to 34, the safety nets are not there. They are non-existent for them. So any type of financial shock is going to be extremely burdensome for them.
Yeah, actually, on that point, I think Scott was able to give us a little bit more clarity around the different types. Right? So when we talk about these financial shocks, you often hear, or these expense shocks, you often hear medical expenses, car breakdowns, which of course we now see are pretty common. But what would it take, or do you have additional thoughts on the frequency that these kinds of expenses, I think, beyond what Scott shared, because the kinds of solutions, I'm not going to ask you explicitly about solutions, but the kinds of solutions I think we could bring to bear are different for someone who has a medical expense shock versus someone who has a cell phone payment. And so in the context of like the different types and the different kinds of solutions we can bring to bear, whether those are increased benefits or increased insurance, what are we missing in terms of our understanding of the types of shocks that people are facing?
Well, oh, Jeff, please. I think you've.
Okay, go ahead, Scott.
Well, so maybe I should say that kind of what part of the reason why we wanted to do studies like this and surveys the way we were was a little bit to sort of get deeper into the kinds of things that people are experiencing. But I think it's worthwhile saying kind of we're asking people unexpected, how often, whether an old car breaking down is unexpected, your old car is going to break down eventually. And so in some senses, one of the things that we're measuring is just people have lots of expenses, some of which they don't know the timing of which are going to occur, and many of which are going to be fairly large. So I think that's number one. And number two, kind of the expenses can occur together. And so often it isn't the one medium expense that's the problem. It's the one medium expense with the second medium expense that adds up to being a bunch of big problems. And that was why I wanted to start with Crystal's problem, because it wasn't that she had the car breaking down that caused her to have to move into her now fixed car. It was the car plus the higher rent plus the medical bills. And so it's the combination of things. And so I think kind of to Stephen, your point, that how people are going to deal with each of those individually matters, and also how are they going to deal with them all together.
Yeah, I think that's right. Like your frequency data, Scott, I just found absolutely fascinating how common some of these expenses are. And I think that it is kind of the compilation of multiple expenses that can be a real problem. I think that, so there's some other data from Morning Consult has their survey of household emergency expenses and decision-making. They also asked people about actual expenses. And I did some digging into that before the session. And what you see is that I think kind of consistent with what Scott was finding, the amount of expenses, the expense varies by type. So at the low end, you have a lot of vehicle problems, for example. At the higher end, you have lots of medical expenses. And the different types is really intertwined with the amount of expense as well. I also think that kind of how there's also this other piece of what's your option set? Can you actually just defer this or not? If your car breaks down, you might say, I can't get to work without my car. If you have some types of medical expenses, you really have to deal with that. But there's other ones where you might say, well, my solution is I have this unexpected problem that I need to deal with, and I'm just not going to go to the doctor. And we see in the shed a lot of people saying, I just skipped medical expenses that I needed to have this year. So I think that whether you can, like, we often talk about, well, you have to cover this expense, but there's also this whole aspect of you should cover the expense, but maybe your best solution is you just have no way of covering it, so you're not going to. Stephen, it looks like you are talking on mute.
Oh, thank you. Sorry. One last question for Samar and Scott, and we're going to open it up more broadly. We have a robust set of questions in the Q&A that I want to make sure that we get to, at least some of them. And so, Samar and Scott, could you talk a little bit more about the kinds of expenses that we're missing in the data? So I think we see, of course, the car accidents and the medical expenses. Of course, these are big ones. but what are the things that we're not tracking for, right? So I really appreciate the example you listed up, Sam, around the unexpected price of a textbook, right? Even if you know that you're going into school in the fall semester and you have some expenses, you may not know exactly how big those expenses are, and that in and of itself is unexpected. So could you what are we missing here? What are the other kinds of expenses that folks are experiencing that could be disruptive to their daily financial lives?
I spoke to this young lady in Texas. She had just moved into an apartment. This was her first apartment. She had planned her entire life around this. Every last dollar was accounted for. This is Texas, super hot in the middle of the summer. As she moves in, the AC breaks. I know we were speaking a little bit about home repair, but home repair for someone that owns the home. This is a home repair for someone that does not have any stake in this home, but her apartment complex refused to pay for it. So she suffered, and she did not have air condition in the heat of summer, this is absolutely dangerous for someone. It ended up being $380. That was the only money she had left over. She had to, like we were speaking about earlier, start prioritizing things that she didn't need just because she needed, air condition. She ended up eating less. She ended up not going to school because she could not afford the transportation costs to her college. That small amount of gas was still a priority for her, not a priority for her. So she said, my money needs to go on air condition because I need to actually breathe in the home I'm in right now without feeling absolutely sweaty. That's just one story. I know we were also speaking about the car breaking down. But I cannot stress this enough, the absolute trickle-down effects of a car breaking down. This young lady lived in Colorado, rural Colorado. Her college was in a metropolitan area. She absolutely needed to drive to college because the fact that her car broke down. There's no public transportation where she was. She missed a week or two of college, fell behind from classes, ended up getting behind the entire semester. The trickle down effects of a 2-week car breaking down absolutely derailed her life for an entire semester.
Well, maybe just to add to, one of the things that we ask is some other major unexpected expense. And I think it's worthwhile just saying that kind of 15% of people experience something else, at least something else that they're willing to kind of tell us about on the survey. And so there is in many ways, people's experiences are just really complex and unique, and the costs that they're exposed to are important. And maybe just as a call out, this is sort of one of the big advantages of things like JP Morgan Chase Institute's sort of bigger data, is that can capture, it can't get the intentionality or the unexpectedness, but it can get lots of things that we wouldn't be able to capture in just a smaller data set in a survey, in a way that kind of can complement and help different ways of looking at things, which Chris is not to say to put you on the spot and say, oh, you have all the answers, but it's just to say that it's one of the advantages of approaching things from a different data set.
So one person in the chat asked, several speakers have described unexpected expenses that lead to an array of financial consequences. Do any of you have research on the long-term impact of young adults, so young adults versus people who are older 35, in terms of their financial security, stability, and economic mobility? And again, this is a question in the chat, so if you want to read it over, you can as well. Or a question in the Q&A, rather.
Maybe I'll say long-term is very hard. Not in the sense that sort of it's hard from a research perspective. I think in the sense that we would love to know all of the consequences of something, but that requires us to have information about somebody over multiple periods, or to be able to have some way of making some sort of inference about something. we try to think about those things, but most of my work has been much more short term, sort of within a year. And that's not because what happens afterward doesn't matter. It's just that that's what we can measure fairly well and be really confident in. But I think kind of that there's a general sense, and I don't want to speak for others, that kind of one set of bad things, even if you kind of can deal with it, leaves you more financially fragile in sort of a general sense for other things. Maybe you have more credit card debt, and so then the next time something happens, you don't have as much. You're already paying that credit card debt, and you don't have as much to borrow on your credit card, and you've already used up your savings. And so that's when you have to suffer through a Texas summer, to use Simmer's example.
Yeah. Sticking with the age question, so do any of you have data on older adults and the potential expenses that they may run into, whether through medication or whether their medical expenses are more severe?
We did look at again through our lens some age differences. The responsivity, the ability to respond by age was not as big as I might have thought it would have been. It is true that like our over 55 and over customers were slightly less likely to be able to respond to either $400 or $600 shock. And I want to say that that was a lot driven by relatively less ability to pivot disposable income. That's not exactly the question that you asked, but it was at least one piece of what we would see. So that might align with Scott Summer. Well, maybe not Summer for older people, but
were those specifically for lower income adults? And part of the reason I'm asking is that sort of one of the things I think is important about kind of looking at older Americans, looking at is sort of that inequality tends to increase. So there are lots of many people have retirement savings as they age, and so the average older adult, if you look at the average, is doing pretty well financially, but there are many who are not doing well, and so once you sort of subset, things look really different. Is that?
No, I don't think so. And I mean, remember here that like the pieces that it was just kind of related to an answer I was thinking about for the prior question. So the piece that we're looking at is like what do you have in your checking account? And okay, there was sort of a gradient there. I don't think that is the main place where you see wealth differences showing up by age. So there's a little bit less of a gradient there. And those the ability to respond using cash out of the checking account didn't vary that much. It was really the disposable income piece, which you can sort of see how that might track with age in a different way.
So another thing I'm curious about, Jeff, is that in recent years, up until we saw the inflation run-ups in the past couple of years, but before that, the number of households or the U.S. adults that could pay a $400 expense using cash as equivalent was going up. And so what do you think was behind that change? And yeah, what do you think was behind that change?
So I think that kind of from 2013 through 2020, when we saw this increase over time, in general, the economy was improving. There was economic growth, and that helps people to have more money in their bank account, more resources for financial emergencies. 2021, we saw a pretty big increase in the share who would cover the $400 emergency expense using cash or cash equivalent. I'm going to use this opportunity to plug Scott's book. There were a lot of fiscal stimulus measures, a lot of efforts to help offset the challenges that people experienced during the pandemic. And Scott can speak to this way more than I can, but we see that flow through into some of our emergency expense measures. So I think it's a combination of sort of the economic growth for a while, but then also these public policies do play a role as well.
And so on that thread, right, someone in the comments, in the Q&A, there was another question around social safety net programs. And And could you talk in general about how you see social safety net programs playing a role in supporting the people's ability to guard against financial shocks?
Scott, do you want to, I mean, I know you've been spending a lot of time thinking about this for your book. Do you want to talk about that? I can certainly chime in as well.
Well, so in some ways, this is one of those places where Jeff has also done research. I'll just speak very briefly about the pandemic. One of the things that we saw was that when there was a lot of government support, specifically cash support, many people had more cash in their bank accounts. And because they had more cash in their bank accounts, there were when they had many of the problems, some of which were new because of COVID, some of which were just the continuing your car breaks down problems. They had the money available to fix it. And so sort of there was a general floating up. I should say that it wasn't all government. People also spent a lot less, didn't go out for restaurants or travel as much. And that just, and the two together meant there was a big buffer of savings. But I know Jeff has actually done research on various social programs kind of in a continuing sense that aren't an emergency sense. And so I think maybe I should turn it over to you.
Yeah, I think that all of these programs play a big role. That like you think about the earned income tax credit, it's once a year, but certainly during that period when people have more money in their accounts, like they're more able to handle various emergencies. I think that from like a true social safety net standpoint, you can think about just programs like unemployment insurance. If you lose your job, you have some level of cash coming in, and so you might need a little bit less of financial buffer than you would otherwise. So I think that like they aren't going to solve everything, but having that backstop in programs like the unemployment insurance benefits and food stamps or SNAP benefits and EITC, et cetera. Like these all are helping to make sure that people at the bottom, who we know that that's where, like, that's not the only place with challenges, but it's the most prevalent challenges. It is helping to lift them up, certainly.
Really quick, just on the earned income tax credit, it's only for people that are 25 to 34. When the earned income tax credit was temporarily expanded to folks 18 to 24, it actually ended up helping another 27 million young adults. YI is pushing for an expansion of the earned income tax credit.
And last question for you, Chris. Kind of buried down in your report, what should I buried down? But like one thing that didn't come up in this conversation is you acknowledge that some people could be extended. They could pay for expenses if they're extended credit, but other people, even if they're extended credit, they wouldn't be able to pay it back. So what does that say to you about the ability for increased credit options to help people be able to pay these expenses?
Yeah, I mean, I want to be careful about reading too much if this is a question about like credit provision, right? Like I don't think I'm saying anything particularly crazy to say that there's a supply and demand side there, right? So observing that if people had more credit, then they would be able to pay an expense isn't the same thing as saying either they would be better off if they had more credit, or that the credit would be provided wisely. So I think with some intention we're trying to stay more descriptive than normative on that particular piece, but just the same, we can see that piece of it. And to answer what I think I hear a little bit more like, and would it be better? Would they be sort of more better off? I think is a really good question to follow up on, but not one that this particular study was very well designed to get at.
All right. Well, thank you all. We are at time. I really appreciate both the panelists and the active engagement from all the audience members. Thank you for these questions. Thank you for attending the panel, and feel free to go to Aspen FSP's websites for more details and just watch the space. More to come. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.